In the summer of 1998, just outside the small town of Black Hollow, South Carolina, a series of strange disappearances began to unfold along a quiet, unlit stretch of road known as Fairview Road. The road itself was infamous locally for winding through dense forest, and those who had traveled it alone at night often whispered about eerie shadows and unnatural noises echoing from the trees. But most people brushed off the stories, writing them off as small-town superstitions and ghost tales meant to frighten teenagers. Until the disappearance of Emily Woods. Emily was a high school junior, known for her bold personality and fascination with urban legends. One humid August evening, she and her friends were driving home from a late-night gathering. As they turned onto Fairview Road, they spotted a lone figure at the side of the road, walking slowly in the opposite direction of town. Emily, always curious, persuaded her friends to slow down so she could get a better look. Her friends told her they felt something wasn't right, there was something off about the way the figure moved. But Emily insisted they stop. She leaned out of the window, calling out to the figure, but they didn't respond. Instead, the figure stopped walking, stood completely still, and then seemed to slowly turn its head toward them. Emily's friends screamed for her to pull her head back into the car, and reluctantly, she did. Her friend Michelle hit the gas, driving away as fast as she could manage. The next morning, Emily went back to the spot where she had seen the figure, determined to find out more. But after that, she never came home. Emily's disappearance was reported to the local authorities. Search parties were organized, but the police found nothing, despite searching for days along Fairview Road and in the surrounding woods. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. Locals were shaken, and parents began forbidding their children from driving along Fairview Road after dark. People tried to forget, but the story of Emily's disappearance had already embedded itself deeply in the town's consciousness. Months passed, and the trail grew cold. Emily's family eventually moved away, and for a while, the town seemed to return to normal. But nearly a year later, reports of strange occurrences along Fairview Road began to surface again. People driving along the road at night claimed to see shadowy figures darting across the road or appearing suddenly in their rearview mirrors. Drivers reported hearing strange knocks on their windows or seeing something that looked like a pale face staring at them from the darkness of the trees. Fairview Road became even more infamous, with locals warning newcomers never to use it after sundown. One summer evening in 2000, a young man named Jake Lawson, who had recently moved to Black Hollow, decided to put the legends to the test. He had always been a skeptic and laughed at the stories he'd heard from the locals. Jake was a college student home for the summer, working as a mechanic, and didn't believe in the supernatural. Eager to prove that Fairview Road was just an ordinary road, he set out around midnight, determined to drive the full length alone. As he drove down the deserted road, Jake noticed how silent everything was. The only sound was his car engine and the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze. Halfway down the road, he spotted something unusual. His headlights illuminated what appeared to be a figure standing by the side of the road, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Jake slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It looked like a young woman, dressed in dark clothing. For a split second, he thought she might be lost, but something about her made him hesitate. She lifted her head, and as her face caught the light, he felt a chill. She looked eerily similar to the descriptions of Emily Woods, her long dark hair, her striking eyes. But her skin looked pallid, almost gray, and her expression was devoid of emotion. She was staring directly at him. Jake's skepticism faltered, and he felt a surge of dread. He pressed the gas, speeding past her, and kept his eyes forward, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw her standing in the middle of the road behind him, staring after his car. That night, Jake returned home in a panic, telling his roommate everything he'd seen. Over the next few days, Jake was haunted by the memory of the figure's face. He became obsessed with Emily's story, spending hours reading old newspaper articles and talking to locals who remembered the night she vanished. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, Jake decided to go back. He convinced a few friends to join him, telling them he just needed one more look at Fairview Road to lay his fears to rest. His friends, reluctantly curious, agreed to go along. As they drove down the road, the atmosphere was tense. They passed the spot where Jake had seen the figure, and the group stayed quiet, each one expecting to see something in the darkness. Just as they were nearing the end of Fairview Road, Jake slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the road, barely illuminated by the car's headlights, was the same figure. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving, slowly walking toward them. Jake's friends screamed for him to reverse, but he felt frozen, gripped by fear. As the figure drew closer, they could see her face, her empty eyes fixed on them. Jake threw the car into reverse, but the engine stalled. He frantically turned the key, trying to restart it, but the figure kept advancing. Finally, with a shudder, the car roared back to life, and he sped away, not stopping until they were miles from Fairview Road. Jake couldn't shake the encounter. He began suffering from terrible nightmares, hearing Emily's voice whispering his name or seeing her face appear in dark corners. His friends, too, were deeply disturbed by what they had witnessed, and none of them spoke of it again. A few years later, authorities announced they'd found skeletal remains in the woods near Fairview Road. They were identified as belonging to Emily Woods. Though the town was relieved to finally have answers, they still couldn't explain the strange sightings on the road. Local legends said that Emily's spirit, restless and angered by her untimely death, continued to haunt the road, warning others to stay away. To this day, people in Black Hollow talk about Fairview Road, warning newcomers of the young woman who appears in the dead of night, her gaze fixed on any who dare to venture near. Some claim the sightings have stopped since Emily's remains were found, while others insist she's still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for those who ignore the warnings. And now, even years later, the town still closes that stretch of Fairview Road after dark, posting signs that say, "Road closed due to unsafe conditions." But anyone who's lived in Black Hollow long enough knows that's just a cover for the real reason. They know that some roads are best left undisturbed, and that Fairview Road, haunted or not, will always hold a piece of Black Hollow's darkest past. In the early winter of 1993, the Murphy family bought an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Harrisville, Pennsylvania. The house, known as the Emerson Manor, had been vacant for years, and locals in town spread rumors about the peculiar events that had supposedly taken place there. People spoke in hushed tones about the house, calling it the Forgotten Manor, and warning of strange occurrences. The Murphys, however, were delighted by the house's historic charm and brushed off the warnings as small-town gossip. The family consisted of Tom, his wife Linda, and their two children, 12-year-old Jake and 7-year-old Sarah. They moved in during December, hoping to spend their first Christmas there. The children were thrilled by the spacious, old-fashioned rooms and the maze-like hallways, and soon the whole family was busy unpacking and decorating for the holidays. But from the beginning, things seemed off. In the first week, strange noises began echoing through the house. It started with soft scratching sounds late at night, which Tom initially chalked up to the house settling or rodents in the walls. But when an exterminator found no evidence of pests, Tom and Linda started to feel uneasy. Jake, meanwhile, began to complain about a strange, unpleasant smell near the attic staircase. Linda couldn't detect anything unusual, but Jake insisted it smelled like old, damp earth, mixed with something metallic. The smell seemed to come and go, but always at night, and always in the same area near the attic stairs. Linda reassured Jake, telling him it was just his imagination, but Jake's unease continued to grow. One night, around 2 a.m., Linda awoke to find Sarah standing next to her bed, staring at her with a blank expression. Startled, she gently asked Sarah what was wrong, but Sarah only whispered, "The man in the attic is crying." Linda's heart skipped a beat. She tried to comfort her daughter, insisting it was just a bad dream, and tucked her back into bed. But Linda couldn't sleep after that, lying awake and listening for any sound from the attic. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior became more unusual. She would wander around the house as if in a trance, humming an eerie tune that no one recognized. When asked, she'd say she learned it from her friend upstairs, though she could never explain who this friend was. And every time Linda asked Sarah to stop, the little girl would get an angry look on her face, something entirely out of character, and refuse. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning out an old storage closet in the attic, Tom noticed something strange. At the back of the closet, hidden behind stacks of old boxes, he found a narrow, locked door. It was painted the same color as the wall, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. Tom felt a sudden sense of dread but brushed it off, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. He called out to Linda, and together, they searched the house for a key. After hours of searching, they finally found a small, rusted key hidden inside a kitchen drawer. It fit perfectly. With some hesitation, Tom unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The room inside was small, dusty, and completely empty, save for a single wooden chair positioned in the center. The walls were painted an unsettling shade of yellow, and the air felt colder than the rest of the house, carrying that same damp, earthy smell Jake had mentioned. The room's presence disturbed Tom and Linda. They couldn't understand why someone would hide a room like this. It had no windows, no lights, and seemed to serve no purpose. They decided to keep the door locked, forbidding the children from going near it. That night, as they lay in bed, Linda swore she could hear soft, muffled sobbing coming from the attic. Tom tried to convince her it was just the wind, but she wasn't so sure. Over the next few nights, the crying grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the attic. Tom would go up to check, but every time, he'd find nothing but silence and shadows. One evening, Jake came rushing downstairs, pale-faced and shaking. He told his parents that he'd seen a man standing in the attic doorway, just staring at him with hollow, sunken eyes. Terrified, he begged his parents to leave the house. Tom tried to reassure him, but Linda was starting to feel the same fear. It was becoming impossible to ignore the strange occurrences, especially since they seemed to be intensifying. That night, Linda woke up to the sound of Sarah's voice, whispering. She found her daughter sitting in the dark, facing the wall, talking in low tones. Linda's heart pounded as she listened, hearing Sarah say, "I'll let you out if you stop crying. I'll let you out, I promise." The next day, Linda decided to search the town's records on Emerson Manor, hoping to find an explanation for the strange events. In the dusty archives, she uncovered a chilling story. Decades earlier, the house had belonged to a man named Samuel Emerson. He had lived alone after his family left him, abandoning the house and all its possessions. Samuel, isolated and descending into madness, had become convinced that something in the house was tormenting him. According to the records, Samuel locked himself in a hidden room upstairs, refusing to leave until he was finally discovered dead. The room had been sealed off by the next owners, who found it too disturbing to keep open. That night, as the family sat around the dinner table, the air felt tense. Linda told Tom what she had discovered, and they both agreed that it was time to leave the house. As they began packing their things, the strange noises grew louder, the pacing, the scratching, and the crying, as if the house itself was protesting their departure. On their final night, Sarah disappeared from her room. In a panic, the family searched the house, their footsteps echoing in the darkened halls. Finally, they found her standing in the hidden room, the door wide open. She was standing by the old wooden chair, staring at it with a look of calm that unnerved her parents. When they asked her what she was doing, she simply turned to them and said, "He's not crying anymore." The family left the next morning, abandoning the house and never looking back. To this day, locals say that if you stand outside the old Emerson Manor on a cold winter's night, you can still hear the faint sound of someone sobbing in the attic. And if you're brave enough to go inside, you might find the hidden room, though no one's ever found the key since. In the summer of 1986, college senior Mark Wilder took a summer job as a park ranger at Crescent Lake State Park in northern Washington. The job was ideal, quiet, surrounded by beautiful scenery, and with plenty of time to finish his last assignments for college. The park was large and rarely crowded, with dense forests and the lake's dark, almost mirror-like water that seemed to stretch endlessly under the canopy of trees. Mark was assigned to patrol an area of the park known as Pine Hollow, a remote section rarely visited by campers. Locals said that strange things had happened there, but Mark wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He wrote off the stories as superstitions and assumed he'd just be dealing with the occasional lost hiker or careless camper. One evening in late July, Mark was on his usual patrol when he stumbled upon an abandoned campsite at the edge of Pine Hollow. The tent was half collapsed, and items were scattered around as if the campers had left in a hurry. Among the items was a journal, partially buried in the dirt near the extinguished campfire. Curious, Mark picked it up, flipping through pages filled with frantic handwriting. The last entry caught his attention. "There's something in the woods. It watches at night. I can feel its eyes, and I know it's waiting. I don't know what it wants, but it's close. Closer every night. This might be my last entry. If someone finds this, please get out of here before it finds you too." Chilled, Mark put the journal in his pack and reported the campsite to his supervisor, who shrugged it off, saying campers left things behind all the time. Mark's supervisor, a seasoned ranger named Joe, mentioned that over the years, others had abandoned their campsites at Pine Hollow, often leaving behind items or even their tents. But there had never been any reports of violence or missing people, so they assumed the campers had just spooked themselves out. Still, the entry haunted Mark, and that night, he found himself unable to sleep, his mind replaying the words. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about Pine Hollow. Deciding to get some fresh air, he took a flashlight and walked down to the lake's edge. The night was unusually still, the air thick with silence. Suddenly, he heard the faint sound of something moving in the brush behind him. He turned, his flashlight illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. Just as he began to relax, he saw a shadow at the edge of the trees, a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still. Mark called out, but the shadow didn't move. He aimed his flashlight at it, and in that brief moment, he could see it wasn't quite human. It had limbs too long, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. But as soon as his light hit it, the figure melted back into the darkness. Mark quickly returned to his cabin, shaken. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, maybe just his tired mind playing tricks. But that night, he dreamed of the figure, standing outside his cabin, watching through the window with hollow eyes. In the following days, Mark found himself avoiding Pine Hollow, focusing on other areas of the park. But each night, he felt the weight of a presence just outside his cabin. Sometimes he'd catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow moving between the trees or hear footsteps pacing outside his window. He even reported it to Joe, who told him to take a couple of days off and get some rest, convinced that Mark was just stressed from the long hours. One evening, while sitting on his cabin porch, Mark noticed a light flickering deep within Pine Hollow. It was too far to be from a regular campsite, and curiosity got the best of him. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the light, determined to find out what was going on. As he entered the dense forest, the light vanished, and he was left alone in the pitch-black silence. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was following him. He swung his flashlight around, calling out, but no one answered. That's when he saw it, the same figure from before, standing a few yards away. But this time, it didn't vanish. It seemed to be waiting. Mark's heart pounded as he took a cautious step back. The figure's head twisted in an inhuman way, tilting as if studying him. Then it moved, its long limbs bending and contorting as it walked closer. Mark stumbled back, managing to turn and run, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he made his way through the dark woods. He could hear it behind him, its footsteps somehow matching his own, and just as he reached the edge of the forest, the footsteps stopped. Mark spun around, panting, but there was nothing there. The figure had vanished. He rushed back to his cabin, locking the door and checking the windows, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The following day, Mark asked Joe about the figure he'd seen, describing it as best he could. Joe went quiet, then finally admitted that there had been other sightings of something over the years. He didn't know what it was, but he believed that whatever lurked in Pine Hollow had been there long before the park was established. Mark considered quitting but decided to finish out the season, staying away from Pine Hollow as much as possible. But the sightings didn't stop. One night, he awoke to the sound of scratching at his cabin door. He froze, listening as the scratching became a soft tapping, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. He stayed silent, clutching his flashlight, and after a few minutes, the noise stopped. On his last night at Crescent Lake, Mark packed his bags, planning to leave at first light. But just before dawn, he heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps outside his window. This time, he gathered the courage to look. Peering through a crack in the curtain, he saw the figure standing just a few feet from his window, its eyes like empty voids. It raised a hand, long fingers brushing against the glass, as if beckoning him. Mark didn't wait. He grabbed his bag and left, not even bothering to lock the cabin behind him. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching him from the tree line. But all he saw was the empty road. After leaving, Mark never spoke of the experience again. He graduated, moved to another state, and stayed far away from Crescent Lake. But years later, he came across a news article about Crescent Lake State Park. The article reported that a group of campers had disappeared near Pine Hollow, leaving behind an abandoned campsite. The search had turned up nothing, and all that remained were rumors of a tall, dark figure, seen lurking in the shadows by the edge of the lake. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he'd encountered at Crescent Lake was still out there, waiting in the darkness for its next visitor to venture too close. And though he tried to forget, he knew that some shadows never leave, lingering in places where the light can't reach.